Hello, and welcome back to Political Science 4781, Techniques of Political Analysis. In this series of videos, we've been talking about a few of our favorite things, by which I mean exemplary data visualizations. We've talked about parts of a whole, that is, smaller things that make up larger things. We've talked about spatial distributions, and we've talked about distributions across time. And now I want to talk about relational visualizations, which have some relationship to parts of a whole. They usually show how some things relate to other things in a similar class or a similar category. So, for example, we have this impressive visualization of gay rights by type and by region. So you've got the American states laid out by region: Midwest, Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, Northwest. And from the center of the circle to the outer edge of the circle, you have rights that are afforded to same-sex couples, from the most basic to the most extreme. Okay? And so what this gives you is the ability both to look at individual states and to get a sense of what they allow and don't allow as far as same-sex couples are concerned. And you can also get a sense of how those rights are distributed by region. And you can get a pretty clear sense that if you're part of a same-sex couple, you would much rather live in the Northeast than in the Southeast, for example. So this shows you similar things, states, in relationship to one another, and at the same time shows you similar things, regions, in relationship to one another. So it's a pretty impressive amount of information to fit into a single graph, and it conveys it all very effectively and very intuitively. Now the next one is a little bit unusual. I'm going to do a couple in the sort of food and beverage world because I think they convey a lot of intuition. If you go into some of the coffee shops in Columbus and you ask for a cup of coffee, it's very rare that you're just going to get a cup of coffee. What you'll probably be asked is, do you want Ethiopian or Kenyan? Do you want dry processed or wet processed or something in between? Do you want light roast or dark roast? And then if you ask them about the characteristics of the coffee that they have, they may talk about the dry fragrance, the wet aroma, how acidic it is or how bright it is, whether it's a light-bodied or a full-bodied cup. And they might even delve into things like, you get hints of blueberry in the coffee, or tangerine, or tangelo, or whatever the hell it is that they tell you is in the cup, without going to sort of ridiculous extremes of arguing over which earthy, tobacco-y flavors you might find in one coffee and which exotic fruits you might find in another. This wheel does a really nice example of comparing, these flavor profile wheels do a good example of comparing flavor profiles across coffees. Now, if you're an aged Sumatra fan, you know that what you're getting is what they call a dirty coffee. That is, it's got a bit of not sediment, but sort of a full-bodied, almost gritty feel to it, even though there's no sediment in it. It's very complex. It's not very acidic, and it's got a lot of body as compared to the Ethiopia Sidama, which is much more even across all of these. It's some cleanliness, some complexity, a fair bit of acidity, a lot of flavor, some body, but it's not really extreme in any one of these measures. It's sort of a jack of all trades, master of none. So these flavor profiles give you a very, and this kind of map is called a radar map, and they're pretty straightforward to do in a lot of different visualization programs, and they give you, at a quick glance, useful information about comparing, the relationship between, in this case, one cup of coffee and another. Now, here's another here's another relational map, and it's taken from a book about food pairings. That is, what kinds of foods go well with what other kinds of foods. And this is a food pairing map for beef, and the beef in the center is the word beef is colored blue. The things that pair well with beef: tomato, corn, thyme, rosemary, mushrooms, garlic, mustard, so on and so forth, they're in red. And you can see the relationships between beef and the things that it goes well with are the direct connections there, the gray lines. Then there's a second layer of things that go well with the things that go well with beef. So if you go up to carrots in the upper left-hand corner, you can see what goes well with carrots. Well, sugar, honey, syrup, coriander, orange, ginger, cumin, right? So you might look at this map and say to yourself, I know how to cook a steak, but I really don't know what should go with it. Well, you could look at this and say, you might want to put some thyme or rosemary on the steak, have a side of mushrooms that are sautéed with bacon, and another side of carrots that are done in orange, ginger, and just a little bit of honey, and roast the carrots and sauté the mushrooms and grill the steak. And that's going to be, even if you don't know that much about cooking, it's going to be a really good meal. It's considerably better than average. So this is another really nice visualization because it shows you in a very compact way different sets of relationships between foods. Now, here, this is one of my all-time favorite visualizations. It's actually an artwork done by an artist in London, and to my intense annoyance, he sold all the copies that he's going to sell of it because I would love to own one of these. He refers to, the title is Everyone Ever in the World, and the text, the area of the entire piece of paper is all the people who have ever lived. The area is proportional to the number of people who have ever lived. The big hole in the center, the area of that hole, is proportional to the total number who have died in war. The smaller holes around the periphery reflect the frequency of conflict by millennium. And the words, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, are the names of all of the deadly conflicts that have occurred, again, grouped by millennium, which is why you see some lines starting up earlier than others and stopping sooner, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing here, aside from just it's a pretty cool visualization, is usually we tend to care about per capita measures, right? We usually care about what's a GDP per capita, not what's GDP. What's infant mortality per number of live births, not what's the total infant mortality, right? He wanted to show with this visualization that with war, we don't really focus that much on the number of people who have died in war per capita. We focus more on, and I think a lot of people, when they look at this, when they understand what it all represents, focus on that big empty hole right in the middle, which isn't that big. It's only 1 or 2% of the total area of the piece of paper. But we have this reaction that it's bigger than it should be, or that it's impressively big. That wars have killed an impressively large percentage of the human race. And if you think about it, 1 to 2%, one or two people out of every 100, that's a lot of people to be killed by war. So this obviously is not something you're going to do with a standard visualization program. It's something that you would end up doing on a much larger scale with a more specialized program. But it really conveys the essence of what it's trying to convey very parsimoniously and very cleanly, and is quite memorable. Next, it's kind of fun. If you Google it, you can play around with it a little bit. It's a periodic table of visualization methods. In the same way that the periodic table of the elements shows the relationship of the elements to one another, this one shows the relationship of different kinds of visualization to one another. And when you mouse over the individual type of visualization, you get details about what kind of visualization it is and how it relates to all of the others. So this, and obviously the original periodic table of the elements is a fantastic example of a relational visualization. And finally, I'm going to put in a video here with that shows, it's a video demonstrating the extent of income inequality in the United States. And it's fairly long, it's about 6 minutes. But it makes a pretty compelling point, and it does so using some very worthwhile design elements. So I will leave you to that, and then I'll be back in the next video to talk about visualizations that contain some element of narrative.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.